Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation. This is the Libertarian Angle. I have as my co-host today Scott McPherson, who has been writing for the Future of Freedom Foundation for many, many years. Scott's a long-time, hardcore, no-compromise libertarian. His articles have appeared in many other places, and he's just a fantastic writer. And got some great news. He is authoring a new book for the Future of Freedom Foundation. It's going to be an ebook on gun rights and gun control. And I've seen the initial draft of the book, and I think it's the best book on gun rights that I've ever read. It's just absolutely fantastic. It's going to be called Freedom and Security, The Right to Keep and Bear Arms. So I thought, well, let's have Scott on as a co-host today to talk about this subject, gun control and gun rights, which I really think, Scott, is the key to a free society. What do you think? Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Jacob. Well, I read something recently, and it basically questioned the idea that an armed society is absolutely or necessarily going to be a free society. And I think that's a legitimate criticism of our position. However, one thing's for certain, if a society loses its freedoms, getting them back is going to be really difficult if there are no weapons in the hands of the citizenry. So while I think that absolutely a society can be free if there's not widespread gun ownership, it's certainly a risky venture. And should government decide to begin rounding people up or locking them up or persecuting people in some way, there's not going to be a whole lot that people can do about that.
Yeah, I'm forgetting the name of the justice on the Court of Appeals out in California. He's a libertarian guy, and his name escapes me right now. But he wrote this fantastic opinion in a case where he was talking about gun rights, and he said that it's really like an insurance policy, and that if a society does not permit gun ownership, it's a mistake that can be made only once. Because, I mean, yeah, you're right. Everything may be running hunky-dory, but the minute that tyrannical regime takes control, that's the end of the story. And this is what the European... Yeah, go ahead.
Absolutely. I was just going to say the same thing. I'm sure that there were a lot of people in the 1930s in Germany that were looking around them and saying, "What do you mean we're not free?" But boy, did that change for the worse.
Oh yeah, and Stephen Halpert's got a great book on that, on gun control in Germany, where he talks about how gun registration lists in the 30s were then in the 20s and 30s were then used by the Hitler regime to go after the people, and he was going after communists first, and then going after Jews, and you disarm people, and then all of a sudden it makes it much more difficult to resist when they're herding you onto the railroad cars to head to the concentration camp. I mean, that's why, Scott, one of the big arguments that some of the more moderate gun rights people use is, the right to go out and hunt, the right to shoot deer and so forth. And I mean, it's nice to go hunting and stuff, but that has nothing to do with the right to keep and bear arms. I mean, they weren't talking about hunting when they enacted the Second Amendment, were they?
Absolutely not. In fact, if you look back on the debates that were taking place then, it's funny to merely bring up the idea of an armed citizenry as a check on tyrannical government. From a lot of people in the so-called progressive side of things, it's sort of a laughable notion that that's what was ever meant by the Second Amendment. But when you look at what people were saying at the time the Second Amendment was being written and debated, and at the time of the adoption of the Constitution, that's precisely what they were talking about when they spoke of guns and an armed citizenry. They wanted the sword, as Tench Cox said, they wanted the unlimited power in the sword not to be in the federal or the state governments, but in the hands of the people, and precisely for that reason, so that if necessary, we could take back our freedoms if we had to.
Well, they had just had the experience, direct firsthand experience. In fact, you go into that in this new book you have about how their own government, that these were British citizens. We often kind of think of the people who signed the Declaration of Independence as great Americans. Well, they weren't. They were great Englishmen.
They were bad Englishmen.
Bad in the sense of how their government was viewing them as traitors and terrorists and so forth. But it had to do with gun control, didn't it? I mean, you kind of explained that in the book. Would you go into that a little bit?
Well, sure. I mean, I guess you could argue that gun control in a broader sense was the spark. When you look at what was happening in the final months of 1774 and the early months of 1775, colonial governors, which were basically crown appointees, were refusing to acknowledge the colonial militias as legitimate forces, which is what inspired people like George Washington and George Mason to form the Fairfax County Militia Association, for example, there in Virginia. They knew what they were doing was illegal because their governors were refusing to legitimize militias. You also had these same governors were ordering British troops, to go and round up the militia stores, the colonial militia stores that were being, that were set aside for use by the colonial militia. And then, of course, you've got the big spark on April 19th. 1775, when 700 British troops marched to Concord, Massachusetts, precisely to confiscate a large store of military weaponry that belonged to the Concord militia. And of course, we know how that worked out. But absolutely, of the many grievances that the colonials had, they were certainly disarmed. There were attempts by the king to prevent the importation of powder and ball into the colonies. These were people who were very afraid that they were going to be disarmed, and they went to great lengths to make sure it would never happen.
Well, it makes sense. From the British standpoint, it makes sense that you go in there and you disarm the public in order to ensure that they start following your edicts, that they had warrantless searches, these general warrants that were enabling them to go into people's homes and look for contraband and so forth. You had the Stamp Act and the tea tax and so forth. Well, when people are resisting these things, from the standpoint of the government, you don't want them to have the ability to resist with force. And so It makes sense that they're going to go in there and disarm people. And so when the Second Amendment, when they start talking about the Constitution and people said, hey, we demand the first 10 amendments here, one of the top amendments was that second one that said, hey, you're not going to interfere with our right to keep and bear arms. My own opinion, Scott, is that the Second Amendment should have been made first, because without the second, really the first and all the rest don't make much sense. If the government can yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I agree, and in fact, it's a toss-up between the first and the second. I think, and I think it's certainly a debatable subject. I'm always reminded of the Woody Allen joke. I can't remember which. I think it was his film Manhattan, when he he's trying to get a crowd of people to go down to a Nazi rally and throw bricks. And some woman that he's talking to says, oh, no, I think it's the sword's mightier than the pen. Why don't you just, go write something making fun of them? And he says, well, it's hard to satirize someone who's kicking your head in. And I really think, I mean, if I had to come down on one side or the other, which is more important, free speech or the right to keep and bear arms, I think I would have to say that I'd rather be armed because, as Woody Allen said, it's hard to make fun of somebody when they're stomping your head in.
Yeah, and if they have the power to just grab you and take you away and torture you and rape you or rape your family, and what good's it do to have the right to speak out and stuff? The minute you speak out, they're going to come and grab you and cart you away. So it seems to me that they have to know, the would-be tyrant has to know that he may be able to do these things, but he might well pay a price for it. And
absolutely,
it's that old saying that the disarmed society is the obedient society, and I think that's what distinguishes in large part the American people from the Europeans. That Europeans, proclaim how great it is that they're all disarmed. But if they get one tyrannical regime, they've got to obey. Now, if we get a tyrannical regime, we still got another option.
That's right. That's right. And some would say that's sort of the nuclear option. It's a worst case type option. And they're absolutely right. And that's something that everyone from John Locke to Thomas Jefferson, where they warned against, entering into a revolution or starting a revolution for light or transient reasons. This was a final option for a reason, because, once you let that genie out of the box, or let that genie out of the bottle, I should say, there's really no telling where things are going. So be careful how you use this power, but it's still there and it's still legitimate.
Yeah, I agree with you that revolution is always your last recourse when everything else has failed. But, there are those that say, well, that just could never happen in the United States, that we've got a democracy and so forth. And I consider that a big joke, that you can have tyranny in any country. And the minute that we disarm, and which is what a lot of the leftists want to do. They want to disarm Americans. That's when you have increased the potential for tyranny. And it could be a very well-intended tyranny. We're here to protect you from the terrorists or the communists or whatever. And they start rounding up the people that start criticizing them. But the idea that can't happen here, I mean, I look at the Second Amendment as an insurance policy. Most times when you have insurance, like fire insurance and so forth, it never triggers. So you may feel like, boy, I wasted all that money on fire insurance for the last 30 years. Well, I look at the gun rights as the same thing. It's an insurance policy. Fortunately, we've never had to use it. But if we didn't have it, the likelihood is that there's a good chance we would have paid the price for it.
Well, I guess I would argue that we have had to use it. In fact, I talk about a couple of examples in the book where people did have to use weapons against their own government officials at times. You talked about how we could never have tyranny here in the United States. Well, tell that to a black person who was living in Mississippi or Louisiana in say 1965. I think they would very much have disagreed with you or disagreed with the notion that we can't have tyranny here, when they were being terrorized by the Ku Klux Klan, often in collusion with their own local government forces. I think those people were very happy that they had access to firearms.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. I found that part of your book very fascinating. And I go into that because we know what the drug war was all about in the early days, the roots of the drug war. I mean, they were using it as an excuse to go after blacks, and you now see that in stories like when they were going after Billie Holiday in this new book by Johann Hari. And but there's also the roots of this racism and gun control too. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, Condoleezza Rice, in her memoir about her parents, spoke a little bit about her father's involvement in an ad hoc militia in Birmingham, Alabama in the early 60s, which I'm sure you know had earned the nickname of Bommingham, because there were just bombs going on right and left. The Ku Klux Klan was terrorizing black neighborhoods. They were blowing up churches. Of course, you had the instance of the 4 little girls that were killed at the Baptist church there in Birmingham, Alabama. But Condoleezza Rice said that it was that experience precisely that made her not only a supporter of the Second Amendment, but absolutely passionately opposed to the idea of gun registration. Because when people like her father and other men around the black neighborhoods of Birmingham were joining together and creating these ad hoc militias or defense associations, they wouldn't have been able to do that if there'd have been a gun registration list. She comes right out and says Bull Connor would have gone door to door and rounded black people's guns up. So I'm sure they're very happy that they had no gun registration back then. But there certainly was widespread terrorism throughout black communities in the 1960s. Of course, not only then, but of course you have to understand that in the 1960s, that's when things were really coming to a boil. You had a lot of agitation from the NAACP and CORE and the Martin Luther King's group, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, I believe they were called, groups that were agitating for changes in the law. They were agitating for increase of voter registration among blacks. These things didn't sit well with the white racists, and most importantly, they didn't sit well with the government officials that these white racists used to keep black people, quote unquote, in their place. And so when groups like CORE and the NAACP were actually able to rally blacks in these deep South communities and then get them to go out and register to vote, this was a serious threat to the white power structure, and they reacted violently, viciously. They attacked black people. They did often nighttime drive-by shootings. The KKK earned the nickname of the Night Riders because they were coming into these neighborhoods at night and shooting them up. And black people very quickly reached the point where they weren't going to take it anymore. And they started arming themselves. They started creating defensive associations. The Deacons for Defense is probably the most well-known, but there were numerous other organizations. Many of them never even had any names. And we never, know anything about those because they've sort of been lost to history. But you can guarantee that the Ku Klux Klan knew about them.
Yeah, there was, as you point out, there total abrogation of the state to do what it's supposed to do, and that's protect the life, liberty, and property of people. And they should have been going after the Ku Klux Klan, but there was really a combination of the Ku Klux Klan and the state apparatus, so that they were. Yeah, go ahead.
In Jonesboro, Louisiana, I think it was, there was an incident where just a few weeks after CORE had moved in and started a voter registration drive, there was a parade. At least that's what the local police called it. There was a KKK parade through the black neighborhood. They colluded with the power company. They cut power to the black part of town. They paraded, I think it was 70 vehicles full of KKK members, hooded KKK members, through the community with a police escort, throwing flyers out the window, warning black people to stay away from CORE and the NAACP. Well, there was a handful of black leaders from this community instantly that very night marched down to the police chief and complained. And he said, hey, we've got a long history in this town of providing police escorts for parades. And they said, you send another parade like that through our neighborhood and somebody's going to die. And it's interesting. That was the absolute last time the KKK received a police escort in Jonesboro, Louisiana.
That's incredible. Well, were there any? I know that on economics, when blacks started out competing whites after the Civil War, it was really an incredible economic miracle story in terms of blacks forming their own businesses and so forth. And that was really the genesis of the Jim Crow laws, where blacks were getting out competed, so they needed protection from the competition of blacks. Were the same thing happening with respect to gun control? I mean, were they trying to put gun restrictions on blacks from owning guns?
Oh, sure. There were attempts that were made after passage of the 13th Amendment, which, of course, abolished slavery. Then they started passing Southern governments started passing what were called the Black Codes, which were restrictions not just on the right to keep and bear arms, but on the ability of blacks to travel freely. It restricted the occupations that they could go into. But most certainly, they were very uncomfortable. It's interesting. The idea of gun ownership being closely linked to American citizenship, the idea and the ideal of American citizenship goes back to the founding of this country. And in the eyes of these white racists after the abolition of slavery, in their eyes, the image of an armed black person was a complete affront to everything they understood. Everything they understood to be true about American citizenship was that it was something to be reserved solely to white people, or certainly something that was to be denied to blacks. So the image of blacks carrying weapons was very disconcerting to these people. And they certainly did make attempts, which is interestingly enough, we talk about the 14th Amendment today and the importance of the 14th Amendment. If you look back at the debates that were taking place, it was almost all about guns. The representatives from the northern states, when they were talking about and debating the passage of the 14th Amendment and enforcement legislation to make sure that the 14th Amendment was respected by state governments, it was almost exclusively guns and gun laws that they were talking about and how those were being used to disarm blacks.
That's amazing. Yeah, that's why I've always liked the 14th Amendment, as it seems to me it gives people a two bites at the apple that are trying to protect freedom, is that they can go to the state constitution and rely on that, but they don't have to rely only on it. They can rely on the U.S. Constitution as well. And as you know, the 14th Amendment is later held to incorporate the First Amendment, and there's still some debate as to whether it incorporates the Second Amendment, I think, but clearly it does.
Well, if we look at what the and again, it's always important to look at what was being said by the people at the time who were writing these amendments and these laws. I mean, obviously, that's going to provide us with the greatest amount of insight into what motivated them. And there's no question that they wanted the 14th Amendment to protect. They said it explicitly that blacks were being disarmed. And it's funny because a lot of gun control advocates talk about how the Second Amendment only protects your right to own a gun if you're in a state militia. Well, that certainly wasn't something that was understood by people at the time when the 13th and the 14th Amendment were being passed, because what they were complaining about specifically was the use of state militias to disarm individual blacks in defiance of the Second Amendment. So there's just something that doesn't add up there as far as the state right or militia right argument that's often presented.
Yeah, but you're right. I mean, here were people fighting against tyranny, because there really was a combination effectively of the Ku Klux Klan and the state apparatuses. And they were using the apparatus of the Ku Klux Klan to assassinate and kill innocent people, people who were just defending their rights to live. And so, yeah, they needed those guns to protect themselves, to dissuade people from going over there and burning their house up and so forth. Let's transition into the other aspect of gun rights, and that's the self-defense aspect. You know, that I mean, in a sense, it's the same sort of thing, defending yourself from the government, but we also have to talk in terms of defending ourselves from other criminals, private criminals, murderers and robbers and thieves and so forth. And one of the arguments that the gun controllers use is, look, that we to eliminate this crime, we have to remove guns from society. And I've always found that very fallacious, because for one thing, the genie's out of the bottle here too, that there's so much widespread gun ownership that it's impossible to eliminate guns from society. So all you end up doing by making it illegal is you disarm the peaceful, law-abiding person who now is no longer able to protect himself from the would-be murderer and robber who doesn't give a hoot about gun control laws. Seems to me that the gun control crowd just can't get that. They can't process it.
Well, it's interesting. Under the Soviet Union, which I would hope would be no kind of society that anyone would ever want to live under again, they managed to effectively disarm their entire population. I mean, you had a draconian gun control laws combined with a massive, powerful police state apparatus. They effectively disarmed the Russian people under the Soviet Union. But it's interesting that their homicide rate, nonetheless, shot up to something like 20 per 100,000. I mean,
wow.
we talk about, there's places in the United States where you can find, 16, 17, 18 homicides per 100,000 in isolated pockets, like, for example, in New York City or perhaps Chicago or Washington, D.C. This was their national average, though, in the Soviet Union, was 20 homicides. It actually went over 20 homicides per 100,000. So something doesn't add up, the idea that more guns is going to necessarily equal more violent crime. There's just something that doesn't add up there. Of course, there's other international comparisons that can be made. England effectively banned all private gun ownership in the late 1990s. Their crime rate, including their gun crime rate, shot through the roof. Their homicide rate went up by 50%. Now, it's interesting that here we are almost 20 years later, and there's a lot of apologists that are running around saying, oh, no, they got that under control. There's not so much gun crime anymore. Well, but there's still that increase in violence. There's still more people being killed in England today than were being killed in England 20 years ago when there was still some semblance of gun ownership in existence. So again, something's not adding up. When you ban guns and crime goes up, how do you make the argument that guns are causing crime?
Right, and there's so many other aspects to this, like the drug war that has brought so much violence to society. And of course, the exorbitant black market prices of drugs that cause people to go out and rob and steal and so forth, the addicts who are going to get their drugs one way or the other. But if they're exorbitantly priced, which is what a black market does, they're likely to take bigger chances by holding people up, robbing them and so forth, because you don't see much of this type of activity to get the money to go out and buy a bottle of wine or something. But my model Scott, has always been Switzerland. And I think that was the model for the founding fathers as well. I mean, here you have a very armed society where people have, everybody practically has got an assault rifle in his home. They rely on the concept of citizen soldiers. They have a very minimal standing army. They have conscription, which we would oppose as libertarians, but they don't have empire bases overseas like the U.S. national security state does. And from what I understand, they don't have a big problem with murder in that society with guns and so forth. Well, tell me a little bit about that.
Oh, they don't. I mean, the overall crime rate and even the homicide rate in Switzerland is lower than, I mean, it's one of the lowest in all of Western Europe. Now, one thing that gun control advocates will be quick to point out, at least those that have done their research, is they'll say, well, but there's more shootings in Switzerland than there is in England. Well, I don't think that it comes as much of a comfort to the person in England who's, say, being stabbed to death or having his brains bashed out with a club, that he's being killed in a way different from someone who's being killed somewhere else. You know, what we're talking about when we have this discussion is what's most likely to create a safer environment for the average citizen. And despite the fact that this huge percentage of people in Switzerland have, as you said, they've got an assault rifle in their home. They not only were given it and trained how to use it, they're required to maintain it, and with, I think, 500 rounds of ammunition in their own home. And that's just for militia service. The average person's access to semi-automatic weapons is not unlike it is here in the United States. But you've got overall a crime and homicide rate much lower than you find in a lot of other countries in Europe that have got these highly restrictive gun control laws.
Yeah, and people are, like you say, are trained. They nobody jacks with the Swiss. Certainly they're not the victims of all these terrorist attacks like the United States is. They don't have this foreign empire where their troops are going over there meddling in the affairs of other countries. I mean, Switzerland was the model when our nation got established with the canton system. That was sort of the state system, the decentralization of powers, the separation of powers, but also the idea of the deep antipathy to standing armies. Because the founding fathers understood that standing armies are a grave threat to liberty. And this is, of course, what Eisenhower was partly alluding to when in his farewell address, he talked about the military-industrial complex, this newfangled way for America, big standing military force, CIA, NSA, that this is a grave threat to the freedoms of a people. And so I think the framers and the founding fathers, our ancestors, had it right when they looked to Switzerland as their model, which for centuries had stayed out of the affairs of other countries, no entangling alliances, as George Washington said, a citizen soldiery that is ready to come to the defense of his country if he's invaded, but widespread gun ownership, not only to protect yourself from the criminal, but to protect yourself from the invader.
Sure, and you're absolutely right. There were, during the debates on the Constitution, there were prominent people at the time that were specifically citing Switzerland and the Swiss militia model there as the ideal. And of course, Switzerland has managed to, except for a very brief and maybe insignificant, you might say, civil war that took place in the 1860s that lasted, I think, maybe a couple of days. Switzerland has been at peace for 200 years now. I think, as of 2015 now, we're looking at 200 years since Switzerland has been successfully invaded. And of course, you've got a long history of centuries before that of Swiss independence, going as far back as the Holy Roman Empire. The Swiss were able to carve out for themselves a measure of autonomy, and it's because they, as Machiavelli said, they're the most armed and the most free. I don't think it was an accident. Some people have said that Switzerland only managed to keep the Nazis out by collaborating with them, and I have no doubt that there were probably some top-ranking Nazis that were smart enough to realize that Switzerland was a safe place to stash their goods. But that really only sort of buttresses our point that, even the Nazis, who saw themselves as the heads of the most powerful army and government in the history of the world, were smart enough to see that Switzerland was a safe place to stash their goodies. But it's also worth pointing out too that the first bank secrecy laws in Switzerland, passed in the early 1930s, were actually passed specifically to protect Jews who wanted to hide their money from the Nazis.
Well, and I think it's clear that, Halbert points this out in his book, I forget the name of it, but it's on World War II and Switzerland, Nazi Germany.
Oh, Target Switzerland.
Target Switzerland. Yeah, where he talks in terms of that Hitler really wanted to invade Switzerland. He
certainly acted like it.
Well, and it was an obstacle to connect Italy and Germany, which were allies. And if there's got a lot of goodies there, that's the type of thing that attracts people like Hitler. That's like free gold that you can all of a sudden seize. But the idea was that his advisors told him, we will end up beating them in the long run. There's no question. But the price we will pay in terms of casualties is so enormous that you will wish you didn't do it. And that was the Swiss mindset. You come into this thing and we will make you pay an enormous price with our soldiers. And there's a great story. I forget exactly how it goes, but it was like in the 1800s, a German prince or a German commander comes to visit Switzerland, and he sees all the Swiss citizen soldiers there, and he says to the Swiss counterpart, he says, "What would you do if my 100-man army or 10,000-man army were to invade Switzerland?" And the Swiss commander says, "Oh, it's not a problem. Each Swiss person would just go out and take up his position, fire 10 shots, and that would be the end of the war."
That'd be the end of the war.
Yeah. It's like you're going to pay a big price, and that's really, to me, the future of this country is you bring all the troops home, you dismantle this apparatus, which really has the potential for tyranny. You see, the first thing the U.S. government does when it invades another country is it institutes gun control. It starts searching homes for guns and so forth. He wants to disarm people. And so you get this apparatus in the wrong hands, and all of a sudden, it's going to be a really bad day. And so the Founding Fathers had it right. No standing armies, no military-industrial complex, no foreign empire, citizen soldiers ready to come to the defense of their country in case of an invasion. There's no chance of an invasion of the United States. Every nation-state's even more broke than the U.S. government is. And that, to me, is the future of this country, and I think the more we look at where we're going as a country today, the more I realize how brilliant, how wise our American ancestors were, the Founding Fathers and the framers and the people that demanded the Bill of Rights, including the Second Amendment.
Oh, absolutely. And it's interesting. There's no other country in history that has actually written into its constitution a protection of the individual's right to keep and bear arms. You mentioned the universal militia system in Switzerland. Yeah, that exists. But that's just a law that says everybody from, I think, 20 to 50 has to serve in the militia, and that they're going to be trained in the use of their assault rifle, and they're going to be required to keep it and maintain it at home, and obviously to respond to a call, an emergency, or do their set amount of training every year. But the actual provision, the actual the absolute statement in our Constitution that the government cannot disarm the people, that doesn't exist, and it's never existed anywhere ever in history, at least not to the extent that it's been enshrined in our constitutional order. And you're absolutely right. Thank goodness they did that. Thank goodness. Wise to do so. And I think what it guarantees is that, at least for the foreseeable future, at least I would say for the next 200 years of the existence of our republic, we can have a relative security, I think, in the knowledge that people are going to have their right to keep and bear arms respected, or at least the ability of the government to disarm the people is going to be extremely difficult.
Absolutely. I mean, like I say, it's like an insurance policy. But what I love also about the Second Amendment and the whole Bill of Rights is that they recognize that these are not privileges granted to us by the government, privileges that can be taken away, that these are fundamental rights with which no government can legitimately infringe or interfere with. On that note, we got to wrap it up. Our time's up. This is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle with Jacob Hornberger and our co-host Scott McPherson. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you next week.